Good morning, everyone. Welcome to class. In this session of the class, we are going to focus on rural areas and their characteristics. First of all, at the end of this session, all participants are expected to do the following. One, define the concept of rural, so that when someone asks you, what do you mean by rural, you'll be able to clearly define that. Then be able to also understand what you've defined. Class, we all know that it is one thing to define, it's another thing to understand. We've always emphasized the need for students to be friendly to themselves by not cramming. When you cram, you are not friendly to yourself. So we expect that you just on your own, in your own terms, be able to understand the concept of rural. We move from there to also emphasize that you will need to also on your own be able to clearly define this characteristics of the rural community. First of all, list them on your own. After the listing, you move to the next level of understanding that which you have listed. These are not difficult tasks to do if you are diligent. So let's move on now with the definition of a rural area. In defining rural areas, certain criteria are used. This criteria will include based on population size. An area can be defined as being rural or being urban. But before we go to this criteria, let's define rural areas as areas that are sparsely populated in which people depend on agricultural land and other natural resources. So if an area is sparsely populated, what we mean by sparsely populated is that the number of persons who are living in these areas may be large, but then the land mass of occupation is also large. And then in most cases also, the number of persons may be few within a large land mass. As we go ahead, we'll be able to look at the issue of population and population density. Now, if an area is sparsely populated and then the people depend on agricultural land and other natural resources, those areas are called rural areas. Now, this population that is sparsely populated um, also is seen to be far from the seat of government. Maybe in place of metropolis, they are not near the metropolis. In place of the state capital, they are not near the state capital. In place of the seat of power, they are not near the seat of power. Now, typical rural areas would have what we call a low population density. Please separate population from population density. We will get to that. Agriculture is just their basic occupation. So, having said that, let's look at some of the criteria that we've highlighted when it comes to defining rural areas. First is based on population size. Now, different countries would use different criteria to define rural areas. In USA, the United States of America, based on population, please pay keen attention to this because it's not um, on the slide. So you may need to jot down so that the knowledge wouldn't uh, elude you so easily. Now, in US, 2,500 people who are living within a specific landmass area. In Japan, 50,000 people. In Norway, 200 persons or less. In Canada, 1,000 persons or less. In Switzerland, 10,000 persons or less. While in Nigeria, 20,000 persons or less. When you have this number of persons occupying a geographical location per kilometer square, such area is said to be rural. Based on occupation, we are clearly saying that most people who are in the rural areas are engaged in agriculture. Their livelihood depends on agriculture. Now, more than 50% of them are actively involved in various agricultural production activities. We are not saying that there are no other off-farm activities in rural areas, but you know that within the occupation of individuals or occupation of groups, there are the core occupation, the basic occupation, and then we also have other secondary occupation. So for the rural areas, the basic occupation is agriculture. Then there may be other off-farm activities that they may get themselves involved. Then we may also look at the degree of isolation or inability to participate in the programs of the larger society. Here we are looking at access to such things as level of education, quality medical services, employment, transportation, and social services. When you come to the rural areas, access to these variables, you see the level of education there is very low. You look at the level of medical healthcare services in rural areas, you don't have tertiary healthcare service providers like teaching hospitals in rural areas. You don't have even general hospitals are very rare, although you can find one or two. I think we have one around us here, but then it's also rare to find quality general hospitals in rural areas. Basically, the healthcare services in rural areas is mainly the primary healthcare centers. Then employment, as we've said earlier on, is restricted majorly within agriculture. The transportation system in rural areas is more crude when compared to the urban areas. We'll come to the comparison between rural and urban, those characteristics that distinguishes the rural areas from the urban areas. But having said this, we've been able to give you clear-cut definition on what an area could look like for us to call it a rural area. If there are clarifications that you would seek, please, you can always get in touch, make your comments in the comment section, or you can contact the course. Now, we go to the characteristics of rural community, which distinguishes them from urban community. There are certain things we see in our rural community which make our rural communities to be different from our urban centers. We've, of course, mentioned some of them in the course of the introduction to this particular session. Now, we look at the size of the community. Now, when we discuss size here, we are talking about the area that is inhabited. Size here means the area that is inhabited. We are not talking about the landmass. No, we are not talking about the landmass. We're talking about the area that is inhabited, the area that people are actually living in. So the farmland and the rest of them may not count in this discussion. What would count here is that area where you have people living and doing one thing or the other. Now, in terms of the rural areas, they have smaller areas that are inhabited when compared to urban areas. So the village communities are small and then the population is also low. Let's look at the density of population. Sometime at the beginning, we mentioned population density. So let's look at the density of population. Rural areas have large expanse of land with relatively small population. The population density, when we say population density, number of persons per unit land area is low. As the density of population is low, now the people have intimate relationships and face-to-face contacts with each other. You know that in a rural area, virtually everybody knows everyone. Like unlike what you see in the urban areas, of course, our society is growing so quickly that we are migrating to the point when neighbors may possibly not know themselves in the urban areas. But in the rural areas, in fact, if there is a new person who joins a rural community, it's very easy to dictate and to point out, unlike our urban societies. Let's look at agriculture being their main occupation. Agriculture being their main occupation. When we look at the rural and urban, In the urban, there are several occupations that people may get themselves involved. You have the medical doctors, you have the lecturers, you have the engineers, you have the accountants, you have the technologists, you have the technicians, and several others. But when it gets to the rural area, the main occupation, agriculture is the fundamental occupation of rural people and form the basis of the rural economy. So a farmer must perform vigorous agricultural activities for which he needs the cooperation of other members. Usually, these members are from his family. In labor, in farm labor, we have always emphasized that farm labor for most rural households come from the members of their household. Rarely do rural households go out to hire labor. So the farming enterprise in the rural areas is majorly anchored on the members of the family. Let's look at contact with nature. Rural areas are very, very close to nature. Here we are looking at how they relate with nature in their daily activities. They believe so much in nature. A lot of things that we try to explain through sciences, a lot of things that we try to explain through innovations. For the rural people, they mean something different. Let's take, for instance, climate change. For the rural man, climate change may not be a result of whatever we are calling hydrofluorocarbons and the rest of them. For the rural man, climate change may be a result of them offending their gods. And so you see that attraction, that close nature, close attraction with nature. You go to rural areas, you have streams. They say nobody fetches water from at certain days, nobody kills the fishes at such streams, and the rest. So they have close contact with nature. Then we look at the idea of homogeneity of population, the homogeneity of the rural population. In discussing homogeneity, we are looking at the nature of the people who live in rural areas, that they are homogeneous. Homogeneous in the sense that the inhabitants are connected so closely, of course, because of the closeness they share in terms of their occupation. There may be people belonging to different castes, religions, and classes, but even at that, they share both worship centers, both farm and other things together. Social stratification. In rural society, social stratification is traditionally based, on caste, on age, on gender. We talk about age groups, we talk about age grades, we talk about different ceremonies that people to get themselves involved before they join certain age groups. So that's what you have in rural areas. The stratification is traditionally based, unlike what you have in the urban centers, where stratification is not traditionally based. Then social solidarity has to do with the extent to which people share common experience, common purposes, customs, and traditions. When you get to the rural areas, you would see that there is a greater level of social solidarity. People tend to work closely together the more, people tend to agree the more. When you get to the urban areas, there is a limited level of social solidarity. But for instance, you can come to the rural area and say, okay, on this Saturday, everyone should come out for cleaning of the road, cleaning of the culverts and the rest of them. And then you see everyone coming out. Go to the urban areas and do the same thing. You will see some people playing football. You see some persons inside the keke going to do business. Except there is an enforcement by the government, these things possibly will be difficult to do in the urban areas. Let's look at the social integration. Class social integration refers to a pattern relationship of one person with another through expressions of ideas, thoughts, and actions aimed at achieving concrete goals. Social contacts are greater in quantity, quality, and variety in urban areas than in rural areas. Of course, there are more persons there, so the social contacts will be more in urban. Then the quality of persons you see in the urban is also higher. You go to the urban, you have first degree holders, master's degree, PhD, professors, doctors, and the rest of them. So the quality is higher, and then the quantity is also higher. In rural areas, interaction takes place at water sites, maybe market days. You have the market days, okay, Oria Fonkwo, for those of us who are from the southeastern part of the nation. And then you have some of our markets are also daily markets, but then that's where social integration takes place. Then religious worship centers, people go to worship, and then people know themselves by the churches they belong to, or by the mosque where they worship, or if they are African traditional religious people, by that they know, they integrate in that line. Then marriage, naming ceremonies, you can mention them. There are so many of them, so many of the indices of social integration in rural areas. The quality and type of integration among the urban dwellers is much more than that of the rural dwellers. Class on social mobility, when we are looking at the movement of individuals from one social class or group to another. Now, there may be vertical movement from lower to a higher level of social group, or from a higher to a lower class. This will come through achievements, which will include acquiring educational qualifications, having political offices. So you can see someone who used to be possibly a teacher, then with a first degree. By the time he becomes a professor, you see that he has gone up the social ladder. So there's a social mobility in that case. You have someone who maybe possibly used to be a town union leader, and then before you know it, this your town union leader becomes a local government chairman. So by that, he has moved from where he used to be to another place, and that is social mobility. Now, as we discuss social mobility, social mobility is rather very slow in rural areas. The area within which one can move in the rural area is much more smaller when compared to the area within which one can move in the urban area. So social mobility is very small and restricted in the rural areas. Let's look at social control, which will be the last but not the least, which has to do with the behavior of individuals in the rural areas. For the rural areas, the behavior is guided more by internalization of social norms and values. People get to know social norms, get to know social values, and that controls how they do their things. And then there are informal means of punishing people. People can be ostracized. In some cases, people can be penalized, and then they say, don't talk to this person because he has gone against the norms of the society. And then a lot of other measures are applied. But for the urban areas, they depend more on formal institutions such as the police, traffic wardens, army, civil defense agencies, and the rest of them to help to build up social control. That's where this class will end for this session. Please, once again, request if you have areas that you need clarifications, do get in touch with the course lecturer or with the course rep, and then we promise to do our very best to make sure that no stone is left untouched as you become the best of whom you are when it comes to rural sociology and agricultural extension. Thank you for your time.